As you know, we've been talking about the Asbury University move of God that's been spreading across the nation. We understand that small beginnings, if not despised, can lead to places of enlargement. And that's what we're so excited about. What started at Asbury is spreading across the nation. And I'm not declaring that this is it, but I am declaring that something's happening. And we are suspicious of what we see taking place. Now, we went to 1 Chronicles chapter 13 2 weeks ago, and we started talking about the move of God. There with David and his first attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem. You remember the story? He placed it on a cart. The oxen hit a pothole. They stumbled. Uzzah put out his hand to try to stabilize it. He was struck. He died there at the threshing floor. Then David looked up, and there's just a little country boy by the name of Obed-Edom. He said, Obed-Edom, come here. And he said, I'm going to leave the ark with you. I'm going to place it in your home. And you're going to have to host the presence of God until I can figure this out. David could tell that something was wrong. He was doing something wrong in his first attempt to bring the ark to bring it to Jerusalem where he had set up his capital. And so Obed-Edom brought the ark into his living room, and he hosted the presence of God for 90 days. And in part one, we discovered that when you're hosting the presence of God, when you're trying to move when God moves, you have to be careful. He said, this is the ark that has my name. And so we discovered that you got to be careful whose name you place on a move of God. There is no celebrity in this room other than Jesus. He's the only one. So we got to be careful by putting our name on a move of God. It's his name. He said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. Not if Randy's lifted up. And so we have to be careful with this celebrity status that we get into in America. Whose name is on this move. And then number two, we discovered that you have to be careful how you move that ark. David put it on a new cart, a new way of doing things. But we discovered that the old-fashioned way of preaching the gospel, worshiping God, preaching about the blood, preaching about the cross, seeing people get saved and water baptized, it still works today as it did 2,000 years ago. So we're not going to use a new cart. We're going to use the old-fashioned way. Then number three, we discovered that you got to be careful. When God starts moving, you don't want to put your hands to it. Uzzah put his hand to that ark, and he tried to stabilize that thing when God was he was trying to shift something. When God's trying to shift in a service, take your hands off of it. Don't try to stabilize what God's trying to do. Just keep your hands off of it and let God be God. And when you do that, people's lives are transformed. So keep your hands off of it. So keep your name off of it. Don't try to dictate how Holy Spirit moves, and then keep your hands off of it and don't try to control it. We found that in part one. In part two, we went into the story of Obed-Edom a little deeper. And we looked at this man who took in the ark of the Lord. He took in the presence of God, and he hosted the presence. Now, I just want to remind you how powerful this was. As you know, under Eli and his two sons, Eli the high priest, Israel went to battle with the Philistines. They were losing the battle. They brought off the ark like a good luck charm, and they thought, well, maybe this will help us to prevail. They went back into battle. They not only got whipped, but the Philistines stole the ark. So they took the ark and they kept it, and suddenly a plague broke out. Things are beginning to happen, and so they said, we don't want this terrible box. And so they sent it back to Israel with 2 milk cows and a cart. Sent it back to them. And that's where David got his idea about a cart. So they sent it back to him. And so this thing comes back, and it's in Abinadab's home, and that's when David decided, I'm going to bring it to Jerusalem. And then suddenly Uzzah reaches out his hand, he dies, and then David takes this simple country farmer, Obed-Edom, and he says, "I'm going to put it in your home." And so Obed-Edom is sitting here and he's thinking, okay, I need to bring this into my house. The Philistines had a plague break out. Their god, their idol, fell over and the head broke off. And then Uzzah tried to touch it and he died, and I need to host this in my home. So you can understand how this would be disturbing to this man and his wife, that we're going to host this terrible box. But yet he did. But then something began to happen. And we discover the secret of Obed-Edom. Because you have to ask the question, what do you do when God moves in? What happens when God moves in? But he discovered that when you invite God's presence in, you can expect his blessings to flow. And that was the secret of Obed-Edom. That when I invite his presence in, his blessings begin to flow. And so I wanted to give you 3 points. The first one last Sunday was this: when you invoke God's presence in your home, you provoke his blessing on your family. For the Bible said that God blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. So hosting the presence of God in your church or in your home, it goes far beyond just you, but it brings a blessing upon your children and your children's children. And so we're going to pick up there where we left off last week. And we're going to give you these last 2 points. My second point, talking about Obed-Edom and this secret that he had of bringing in the presence and experiencing the blessings of the Lord. So here's my second one. When you follow God's presence into your future, his blessing cancels the curse of your past. When you follow his blessing, his presence into the future, it cancels out the curse of your past. Remember, the Bible said, and it was told King David. King David, again, was trying to deal with this whole thing of bringing up the Ark of the Covenant, or the Ark of the Lord, to Jerusalem. And yet, Uzzah died when he reached out and he touched it. David thought, this terrible box. A plague broke out with the Philistines. Uzzah loses his life. Obed-Edom, you take it into your home. And David's trying to figure out, what do I do now? And yet he begins to hear the story of Obed-Edom. I mean, the blessings of the Lord. The Bible said that the blessings of God came on him, his household, and everything that belonged to him. Things begin to happen. Things begin to happen for Obed-Edom. The favor of God was upon him. Now we know that David had a passion for the presence of the Lord. You discover that in the book of Psalms, and as he begins to write these love songs. David had a passion for the presence of the Lord. We saw it when he made the second attempt. The second attempt, he went back and he read the manuscript, and he figured it out that you can't bring the ark of the Lord on a new cart, but you got to go back to the old-fashioned way and carry it up on the shoulders of men, that being the Levites. And when he was bringing it to Jerusalem, the Bible says he took off his kingly robe, his identity as a king. He humbled himself before the Lord, and he danced before the Lord. He brought the ark to Jerusalem. So we know that he had a passion for the presence of God. He had a passion. And it says that, and David was told what was happening to Obed-Edom. Now, you have to realize that Obed-Edom was a Levite, it says in another place, but yet he lived among the Philistines. And God was blessing him. You have to know that the name Obed-Edom, it means slave of Edom, the enemies of Israel. Now, this is the reputation that Obed-Edom had. He was a slave. He was in a foreign country. He was not living among the people of God. Obed-Edom, a slave of Edom. But you have to know this, that when you experience God's presence, his blessing becomes your reputation. Because it said that David had heard of the blessings upon this slave of Edom. David had heard of the blessings of the Lord that had fallen upon this man. So you have to know that when you follow the presence of the Lord, as Obed-Edom did, as you follow the presence of the Lord, you'll find that his blessings will cancel out the curse of your past. You may say there's this curse on Obed-Edom. There's this curse on his family. We talk about generational curses, but you have to know that as you follow after the presence of the Lord, it will break that curse off of you. And his presence, his blessing becomes your reputation. He was blessed. Psalms 23, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So when you follow God's presence, goodness and mercy will follow after you and your family all the days of your life. That's why I want you to see this secret of Obed-Edom, that as you invoke the presence of God in your home, you provoke his blessing on your family. And as you pursue the presence of God, as you chase after the presence of God, you'll find that mercy and goodness will chase after you. And it will overtake you and your family. You see, a generational curse can be broken by a generational blessing. It can happen. I've heard people say, Pastor, there's just something in my family. I've heard people say, I was an alcoholic, my father was an alcoholic, and my grandfather was an alcoholic. Well, listen, it's time to break that. And we break these things by pursuing after the presence of the Lord, and suddenly the blessings of the Lord overtake us, and it changes us. It changes our reputation. Where we were a slave to poverty, now we're experiencing prosperity. Where we were a slave to sin, now we're experiencing freedom because we're pursuing the presence of the Lord. Obed-Edom had a reputation as being a slave of Edom, the enemies of Israel, but suddenly that reputation is changing. The king of Israel, King David, is hearing about the blessings of the Lord, and suddenly Obed-Edom is being changed from a slave to the man that's living under the favor and the blessings of God. God can change your narrative. God can change your storyline. He can shift you from being a slave to being victorious and being free if you'll just pursue the presence of the Lord. A generational blessing can cancel out a generational curse. My third point this morning is that when you bring God's presence into your home, you release his blessing on your belongings. When you bring the presence of the Lord into your home, he blesses your belongings. Look at this. The Lord had blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So you have to see this. Number one, Obed-Edom brought the presence of the Lord into his home. He invoked the presence of God. It provoked a blessing on his household. And his sons began to serve the Lord. I made the statement to you last week that if you'll make room for God's presence in your home, God will find a place for your children in his house. Right? So Obed-Edom brought the presence of God in his home, and it impacted his children. They became gatekeepers, doorkeepers in the house of the Lord. If we'll serve God and if we'll pursue him, if our children and our grandchildren will hear us talking about the word of the Lord, this is what God's saying to me. This is what God's doing in my life. I've shared with you before some of the stories of my past and my kids and how they saw the hand of God moving in my life and in my ministry. And that was so important to me because I knew if I made room for his presence in my home, if I made room for his presence in my life, he will find a place for my kids in his house. And they would serve the same God that I'm serving because they experience the presence of the Lord. That's why it's so important that your kids and your grandkids come into your home and they sense the presence of the Lord. They sense peace and comfort and safety because if they come into your home and they sense the presence of the Lord, it's going to impact their life. It's going to move on them. But if all they sense is chaos, if all they sense is trouble, that's going to make them feel insecure. They need to sense the presence of the Lord. That's why I get up many times. I get up, sometimes it's in the morning. Today it was in the morning. I got up before daylight and I was in my living room praying. The other day it was in the afternoon. I found a moment and I was in my house praying. It just depends, but I get in there and I pray and I bless my house and I bless the atmosphere. And I ask the Father just to shift the atmosphere in my home where when people come into my home, I want them to sense the presence of the Lord so that when my family comes in my home, they sense the presence of the Lord. And so Obed-Edom discovered this, that I'm going to go after the presence and it's going to impact my kids. And then he discovered that if I go after the presence, it's going to change my reputation. I've got a bad reputation. Obed-Edom, I'm the son, I'm a slave of Edom. I'm in bondage. The chains are on me. But God's going to change my reputation. God's going to change my storyline. God's going to change this thing. People are going to quit talking about what I did, and they're going to start talking about the blessings of the Lord that's on my life and the favor of God. But then 3, he discovered that the blessings of God or the presence of God would bring blessings on his belongings, everything that belonged to him. And it's because of that ark. Now that box, that terrible box, you have to know the contents in it so you can better understand the power of it. Number 1, there was a jar of manna. You remember God fed Israel with manna while they were in the wilderness. They get up every morning and there was manna, angel food, out on the ground, okay? And they'd pick it up. I called it Pop-Tarts. They got up every morning and there was Pop-Tarts out on the ground. Just pick it up and eat it. That jar of manna that God told Israel to put in that ark represented provision. Listen, you need to grab a hold of this. The presence of the Lord in your home and in your church means provision. It will cause your tomatoes to get bigger than anybody else's tomatoes. Listen, the neighbors of Obed-Edom, they'd come by and pause and look at his garden. They're thinking, there's that old slave of Edom. His tomatoes are bigger and redder and juicier than any tomatoes I have. His cucumbers, his okra, everything was just prospering. His grass was greener. His flowers were more vibrant. There was just something about Obed-Edom's home. The favor of God had fell on that house. You have to understand that in that ark, there was provision. Number 2, there was Aaron's rod that budded. That speaks of power. Now you got to realize this is the rod of Aaron. There was just a stick. It had no roots, it had no branches, it had no leaves. It's just like a walking stick. But they set that thing in the tabernacle in there. God said, I want you to set that thing in there. And that's a story within itself about leadership. But he said, you want to challenge leadership? He said, put your walking sticks in that tabernacle near that ark, and I'm going to show you. And suddenly overnight, Aaron's rod, not only did it bud, but it began to produce fruit. Think about that. It began to, almonds, it began to produce. You have to understand that where the presence of God is, there is power. Power to change. Power to bring life where there's death. How many wants to believe in healing and divine health? Then get the presence of God in your home. Listen, just like the story I shared with you just a moment ago about that young lady here in Beaumont that was on her deathbed and she's watching our program. Suddenly the presence of the Lord comes into that room and life begins to be restored to her. Listen, get the presence of God in your home. Get it in your home and watch. Listen, I was in my house the other day just thinking about this point, and I was praying over my house, and I declared in my house not only the presence of the Lord, but I declared in my house health and long life, that in my house there's a fountain of youth. I look younger today than I did last Sunday, don't I? Get the presence of God in your home and watch the power of God at work. Watch God's presence and what it will do for you. Aaron's rod began to bud. That which was dead, it began to live again. And you'll see if you'll get the presence of God in your home. Number 3, in that ark was the tablets of the covenant. And that speaks of protection. The word of the Lord watching over you, watching over your family. Listen, sometimes when I pray, I'll declare his angels are camped out on the 4 corners of my property, watching over my family. He said, I'll give my angels charge over you. The word angels in the Bible speaks of deputy. It's the deputies of heaven. They've been given delegated authority to watch over you. So get in your house and declare that the angels of God are watching over you and watching over your babies, watching over your family. That ark of the covenant in Obed-Edom's house, look at what it represented, the kingdom of God, his presence, his provision, his power, and his protection, to the point that David got jealous. Let your neighbors walk by your house and just sense something and go, what is it about your house? It's the Ark of the Covenant. It's the presence of the Lord. It's the secret of Obed-Edom. In my house is the provision, the power, and the protection of God. So get up in your house this week. Turn off that mess on your television set and the internet. Cut the cord to that stuff that's unrighteous and impure and unclean. Get that stuff out. Now listen, I'm not talking about legalism. I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about learn to filter what you let come into your house and get in the middle of your living room and declare that this is the sanctuary of God. The ark of the Lord is in my house. Holy Spirit, you're welcome. And I declare that God's provision, power, and protection is here in my house. The word of the Lord. So that when the angel of death comes, you get a Passover. Exodus 12. He said, if you'll do what I tell you to do, the angel of death will do a Passover. So get in your home and let the word of the Lord, the 10 commandments, the word of the Lord be your protection, where the angel of death will pass over your house. And let our people become the envy of others because of the presence of the Lord. The miraculous sign of God's presence. Exodus chapter 8. On that day I will deal differently where my people live. I will make a distinction between my people and your people, talking about Israel. He said, I'm going to make a distinction between the people of Egypt and the people of Israel that were in Goshen. He said, this miraculous sign will occur. The word distinction there in the Hebrew means redemption, covenantal responsibility. Whenever you get in your living room and you declare that this is the sanctuary of the Lord and the Ark of the Covenant is in my house, God's provision, his power, and his protection. When you put the blood over your doorpost, you put the name of Jehovah God on your house, and you say, this house belongs to him. When you do that, there's a distinction that's made, and suddenly you get into a covenantal responsibility where God is responsible for you. He'll take care of you. He'll watch over you if you'll put his name on your house. Listen, the space God occupies is the place God takes responsibility for. That's why I believe so strongly in tithing, because the 10% has redemption power to redeem the other 90%. Jesus is the firstborn among many brethren. The 10% has redemption power. So whenever I give my 10%, it has the power to redeem the other 90. Whenever I give God that 10%, I step into a covenantal responsibility with him where he says, son, you've honored me with your tithe. Now I'm going to take responsibility for you and your finances. I'm going to take care of you. How many believes God can take care of you with a 90 better than you could ever do it with 100? They're talking right now about these banks that are failing. They're worried. Everybody's worried, and I understand. But let me tell you something. I'm sleeping at night. I went to bed last night at 9:30. I was wore out from walking. I woke up and climbed out of bed at 4:45 to get up, and I spent some time in prayer this morning and just thinking about this service. But let me tell you something. I slept last night. Let them banks do what them banks do, because my house, my family is in a covenantal relationship with my Father. His name is Jehovah Jireh, and I'm going to be at peace and know he's going to take care of me. Come on, give him praise. Stephen, come help me. Provision is the miraculous sign of God's presence. It is. He said in Exodus chapter 8, I'm going to make a distinction between you and my people, and this miraculous sign will occur. Provision. When the neighbors walked by Obed-Edom's house, they said, what is it about that boy? The grass is greener, the flowers more vibrant. What is it about that boy? What's going on with him? He said, I got the Ark of the Covenant in my house. His provision, his power, his protection. I sleep under the canopy of God's protection. Isaiah chapter 4, verse 5. For over all the glory, there will be a canopy. That's why I don't mean to be just repeating myself, but that's why I'm always trying to encourage you to get in your home and just invite the presence of God and get the glory of God in your house, because God said, wherever my glory is, I'm going to put my canopy. God's going to protect what's his. It's a covenantal responsibility, and you need to realize that and step into it. So know this, that the secret of Obed-Edom, you got to know it, that in 90 days, Obed-Edom became addicted to the presence of God, for he learned that intimacy would provoke blessings. That's why 1 Chronicles chapter 15 said, Obed-Edom, the gatekeeper. You see, when David came up to Obed-Edom and said, look, son, I'm going to leave the ark with you, this terrible box. The Philistines didn't want it. Uzzah touched it and died, and David said, I can't take it right now. But Obed-Edom, I want you to keep it. Can you imagine what that was like and trying to explain that to his wife? You'll have to vacuum around it, but don't touch it. Tell the children, stay away from it. But suddenly things begin to change. And then 3 months later, King David comes back and says, son, you have a reputation now of being blessed. You were a slave, but now you're blessed. I'm sorry, but I got to take this ark to Jerusalem. And so the Levites came in, they ran the poles through the eyelets, and they put their shoulder into it, and they lifted that thing, and we believe with supernatural assistance, because it said that God helped the Levites, and we believe that ark weighed over 1,000 pounds. And so with supernatural assistance, they picked it up and they walked out of the house. And Obed-Edom was watching that ark as it's being carried toward Jerusalem. And he went to his wife the second time and said, honey, pack the kids, pack the bags. We're going to Jerusalem. Because I refuse to live where God's presence once was. You see, guys, listen, we all want revival. We do. But let me just tell you one of the things about revival. When you really experience a move of God, it will mess you up. Isaiah chapter 6, he said, I've seen the Lord, and now my life is undone. I'm all undone. The world doesn't want me, and the church doesn't understand me. You see, revival will mess you up. And it messed up Obed-Edom. The Bible said that he became a gatekeeper. And he chased after the presence of the Lord. He wasn't going to live where God once was. So what is the story of Obed-Edom? He stayed with the presence. And he saved his family. Instead of his sons becoming slaves of Edom like him, they became gatekeepers in the house of the Lord. So what you do in chasing after the presence of God, when you refuse to live where God once was, I'm so glad that God touched you 20 years ago in a camp meeting, but has he touched you recently? You can't live where he was. You gotta follow after him where he's going. And please know that when you do that, you're doing it not only for yourself, but for your children and your children's children. What I do and what you do, we don't do it just for ourselves. Listen, we're doing it for our families. What I do in this city, what I'm fighting for this city, fighting hell, listen, I do it for my family. I do it for your family. Believing God. We fight for our families. So, just know this. The next time God moves, like Obed-Edom, make sure you move with him. Get up and say, come on, honey, pack the kids, pack the dog, the cat. Here we go. We're going to Jerusalem. Because I refuse to live where God once was.